It was just past sunrise when Celeste Monroe stepped onto Flight 382, her heels tapping softly against the polished terminal floor as she moved with quiet poise through Gate 6. The airport was waking up, a dull hum of rolling luggage and sleep-deprived chatter hanging in the air. But Celeste moved through it like she was part of a different world altogether, untouched, focused, serene. She wore a fitted navy sheath dress, the kind that hugged just enough to suggest class without trying, and a tailored blazer that looked as though it had never known a wrinkle. A silk scarf, deep indigo with gold accents, was draped lightly around her neck, and in her hand was a small black leather satchel that looked expensive, but worn in a way that suggested it had traveled with her often. Her expression was unreadable, her stride steady, and yet there was something unmistakable in the way she held herself. Shoulders back, chin up, eyes scanning but not staring, that gave off the faintest shimmer of power. Not arrogance, but certainty. She walked like someone who didn't need to explain herself. Celeste didn't look at her phone, didn't shuffle through papers or boarding passes. She already knew where she was going. With an effortless movement, she approached the scanner, holding out the digital ticket on her phone. The gate agent smiled politely and scanned it without pause, barely glancing at her face before waving her through. "Enjoy your flight," the agent said. Celeste nodded once softly and moved forward into the jet bridge. The cabin was still mostly empty as she stepped onto the plane, the quiet beep of boarding announcements occasionally breaking through the low hum of prep work. A few passengers were already settled in coach, and a couple of executives were chatting in first class. Celeste's seat was 2A, a window seat with extra legroom and a pristine view of the wing. She stowed her bag overhead and eased into her seat with a grace that made it look choreographed. As she sat, she glanced once out the window and then down at the small leather-bound notebook she pulled from her bag. She flipped it open and began to write. No phone, no distractions, just pen and paper. It didn't take long before people began to notice her. A woman like that, composed, elegant, alone, drew curiosity. She wasn't flashy, not by any means, but she didn't blend in either. She was too still, too calm. In a space full of bustling energy and routine, Celeste's presence was unsettling in its stillness. The man in 2C cast her a sidelong glance, then looked away quickly. A couple boarding behind her hesitated for a moment as they passed, whispering something too low to hear. Even the flight attendants glanced at her a second longer than usual as they passed, trying to place what exactly felt off. The whispers started before the plane had even fully boarded. She doesn't look like a regular. Is she famous? Maybe she's in the wrong seat. At the front of the plane, one of the flight attendants, Emily Hargrove, was finalizing her pre-flight checks. Emily was a rule follower, crisp and polished in her uniform, her dark blonde hair pulled back in a perfect chignon. She'd worked with the airline for almost 8 years and had a reputation for being efficient, if not warm. Her sharp eyes flicked over the first-class cabin as she walked through, mentally checking seat numbers, tray tables, and faces. She noticed Celeste immediately. Something about her presence struck a chord, like a painting hung slightly askew. Emily paused for a heartbeat longer than usual, then moved on. But the thought stayed with her. There was nothing overtly wrong with Celeste. She wasn't disruptive. She wasn't complaining. She wasn't demanding champagne or rearranging luggage bins like some first-class passengers like to do. She was just quiet, still. But something about her air, her calmness, her complete lack of nervous energy made Emily uneasy. Most first-class passengers had an edge of entitlement or exhaustion. Celeste had neither. She sat like the seat belonged to her in a way that suggested she didn't care whether anyone believed it or not. Emily shook it off and continued down the aisle, but a sliver of doubt had wedged itself in her mind, and that sliver began to grow. Back in her seat, Celeste continued writing. Her pen moved in slow, elegant curves across the page. She didn't notice, or pretended not to notice, the glances, the hushed commentary. Her expression was unreadable, a calm mask, as though she'd already anticipated every reaction. It was not the calm of ignorance, Siobhan. It was the calm of someone who knew exactly where she stood and why it made people uncomfortable. The cabin filled quickly, but even as passengers settled in, Celeste remained an anomaly. By the time the safety announcements began, the air had shifted slightly. The unease, subtle at first, had taken root. Emily made another pass through first class and once again found herself glancing at 2A. Celeste looked up just once, their eyes meeting. There was no confrontation, no smile, just a calm acknowledgement. Emily blinked and looked away, unsettled. She didn't belong. Emily was sure of it, not based on her ticket, based on something deeper, something she couldn't name. That feeling, so small and insidious, had already begun to twist into suspicion. And that was the moment, the quiet, unspoken moment, when the course of the flight began to shift. Not because Celeste had done anything wrong, but because she had done absolutely nothing at all. It was the briefest glance, the kind of look that should have passed unnoticed, but it didn't. Not to Emily Hargrove. As she walked back through the aisle for a second sweep of the first-class cabin, her eyes drifted again to 2A, where the woman from earlier, Celeste Monroe, sat as calm as ever, pen moving fluidly across her notebook, utterly unbothered by the swirl of morning travel chaos around her. Emily's steps slowed, and for a moment, her training slipped behind something else, something more human, more flawed, more dangerous. It was the way Celeste sat, unshaken and centered, like she didn't need to prove she belonged, that triggered something Emily couldn't quite name. It wasn't arrogance, but it wasn't submission either. She wasn't fidgeting, wasn't adjusting her posture like most passengers did when they weren't used to this level of comfort. She looked rooted. And that was the problem. Because somewhere in the depths of Emily's mind, buried beneath years of uniform smiles and quiet assessments, something whispered, "She doesn't belong here." And that whisper was enough to light the fuse. "Excuse me, ma'am," Emily said, voice soft but edged in something less kind. Celeste looked up, her expression open, unthreatened, her eyes meeting Emily's with quiet curiosity. "Can I see your boarding pass again?" Emily asked, trying to keep her tone neutral, but her jaw was already too tight, her shoulders too rigid. There was no real reason to doubt her, not technically, but doubt had already bloomed and taken root like a weed. Celeste, calm and composed, handed over the digital ticket without hesitation. "Of course," she said simply. Emily barely glanced at it. First class, 2A, confirmed. But still, something felt wrong, not on the paper, in her gut. A good flight attendant knew to trust instinct. A great one knew when instinct was actually bias. But Emily didn't see the line, not yet. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Thank you," she said curtly, then walked away. But she didn't let it go. Instead, she leaned toward Clara, the younger attendant prepping drink carts near the galley. "Keep an eye on 2A, she whispered, nodding toward Celeste's seat. "Something's not adding up." Clara blinked, confused. "Her ticket checks out," she said. "I offered her water earlier. She was polite." But Emily didn't hear that, or rather, she chose not to. By the time she returned to 2A, the decision had already been made in her mind. "Miss Monroe," she said, this time standing stiffly, arms folded like a gatekeeper. "Could I speak with you for a moment, in private?" The surrounding passengers subtly tuned in, the way people do when drama unfolds in a place where everyone's confined and nothing else can distract them. Celeste looked up again, calmly, confusion dancing across her brow, but not enough to rattle her. She stood, nodding once, and followed Emily toward the galley without protest. The whispers followed, like shadows clinging to her heels. "I'm afraid there was an error with your seating," Emily said once they were out of earshot. "We'll need to relocate you to the main cabin." Celeste blinked, stunned, but didn't falter. "An error?" she echoed, her voice still soft. "I booked this seat weeks ago. First class. Confirmed. I checked in at the gate without issue." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't fight. But something in her tone, too composed, too measured, made Emily feel suddenly exposed, as though the lie she was telling herself couldn't hold water much longer. "I understand," Emily replied coldly, "but we're resolving a discrepancy, and I'll have to ask you to move. If you don't comply, security will meet you at the gate." There it was, the threat. The flash of power so often wielded in uniforms, quiet, clothed in protocol, but with teeth beneath the surface. Celeste stared at her, and for the first time, something stirred in her expression. Not fear, not anger, just a slow, sorrowful recognition. She understood exactly what was happening now, but she didn't challenge it. She didn't raise her voice or say the words that might have scorched the walls. Instead, she nodded once and turned away, gathering her bag and walking down the aisle like someone carrying a weight no one else could see. The stairs that followed her felt like glass shards beneath her feet, but she gave them nothing. Not a tremble, not a word. Middle seat, row 18. She sat down without ceremony, set her bag beneath her feet, and stared out the window at the horizon. There were no clouds on the glass, but inside, a storm had already begun to rumble. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and typed a message. Short, sharp, strategic. She didn't need to say much. The right person would know what to do. Message sent, game set. Patience now. And while the rest of the plane returned to its routines, seatbelts clicking, engines humming, flight attendants resuming their duties, Celeste Monroe leaned back in her seat and smiled. A quiet smile. The kind that doesn't come from amusement, but from knowing something no one else knows. Because what Emily had failed to realize in her rush to protect the order of first class was this. The woman she had just exiled to coach didn't just buy a ticket, she bought the plane. You see, Celeste Monroe wasn't just another name on the manifest. She was the manifest. And while Emily was busy looking for people who fit the part, she never once thought to ask who wrote the script. This wasn't the end of the story, not even close. So keep watching, keep listening. Because when you act on bias, when you let your assumptions override your judgment, sometimes the person you push down is the one holding the ladder. And when that person decides to climb back up, you'd better believe you're going to feel every single rung. Stay with us. The real turbulence is just beginning. The plane had been in the air for less than an hour, but to Emily Hargrove, it already felt like a lifetime. She moved up and down the aisle with practiced precision, refilling waters, offering packaged snacks, and smiling so tightly her jaw ached. But her eyes kept drifting, always back to row 18, always to Celeste Monroe. Something about the woman's silence was unnerving. She hadn't asked for anything since being forced out of first class. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't complained, and somehow that made everything worse. She sat there perfectly still, legs crossed, notebook back in hand, her pen gliding slowly across the page, as if she had nothing better to do than document the moment. There was a calmness about her that felt intentional, like she was waiting, watching, not helpless, but composed, unshaken. And the more Emily glanced back, the more she started to feel like she had made a mistake, though she couldn't yet admit it to herself, not fully, not out loud. A sudden burst of turbulence shook the cabin, jolting trays and drawing startled gasps from several passengers. Emily instinctively steadied herself, reaching for the overhead bin to balance as the plane bobbed once, then again. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged overhead, and the captain's voice came through the intercom with a calm but firm announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we've hit a rough patch. Please return to your seats and remain buckled until further notice. The usual shuffle followed, passengers murmuring, attendants securing carts, but Celeste barely moved. She simply paused her writing and waited, head tilted slightly, expression unreadable. But then came the sound that shifted the mood entirely. A soft thud, then a muffled cry. Emily turned instinctively, scanning the rows, and spotted the source instantly. A young mother 2 rows behind Celeste, desperately trying to comfort a baby now screaming uncontrollably in her lap. A diaper bag had fallen during the turbulence and scattered its contents across the aisle. Bottles, pacifiers, and baby wipes lay strewn across the floor. The mother's face was red with embarrassment. Her eyes panicked as she tried to contain the chaos. No one offered help. Not yet. Most passengers looked away, annoyed or uncomfortable, retreating into their headphones and eye masks, except Celeste. Without hesitation, she uncrossed her legs and bent forward, scooping up a baby bottle that had rolled beneath her seat. She reached for a container of wipes, neatly gathering items into the diaper bag with a quiet efficiency. Then, as if sensing the exact moment of emotional overload, she turned to the mother and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're doing fine," Celeste said, her voice low and steady. "Take a breath." The woman looked up, startled, but then her shoulders dropped ever so slightly, and she nodded. For the first time since the turbulence, the baby's cries softened, as if the calm from Celeste had seeped into the air around them. Emily watched it all unfold from the galley, her hands frozen mid-movement. She should have gone to help. That's what protocol demanded. But Celeste had acted faster, more naturally, more humanly than anyone else on board, including the crew. And it was that moment, as Emily watched the woman she had forcibly removed from first class, kneeling to help a struggling stranger in the main cabin, that something deep and heavy began to shift inside her. Guilt. Not the vague discomfort from earlier, not a sliver of doubt. This was a rising tide, a cold, crashing awareness that she had not only misjudged Celeste Monroe, but that she had wronged someone who clearly lived with integrity, grace, and control. Celeste had every reason to lash out, to demand restitution or make a scene, but instead she knelt in the aisle, wiping up baby formula and whispering kind words to a complete stranger. And then she returned to her seat, her skirt now faintly stained, her posture still perfect. She tucked the notebook back into her bag and resumed her quiet wait, her gaze once again drifting to the clouds beyond the window. It was unbearable. Emily couldn't stop thinking about the look in Celeste's eyes when she was asked to move. The quiet disbelief, the dignity with which she'd stood up and left. No defensiveness, no desperation, just disappointment. Not in herself, but in the system that had failed her. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? It hadn't just been a seating issue. It had been a judgment, a silent verdict passed down because someone in uniform thought they knew what belonging looked like. And Celeste hadn't fought back because she didn't have to. She had known exactly who she was, and that power, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken aloud, was finally starting to haunt Emily. Now, every time she glanced at row 18, it felt like a reckoning. Celeste's calm wasn't passive. It was pointed. She was giving the airline, the crew, and everyone watching the chance to correct themselves. But not forever. There was an elegance in her silence, but also a warning, like the eye of a storm before the winds returned stronger. And you could feel it. Even the other attendants were quieter now, more careful, casting glances towards Celeste that held a subtle deference. Clara, the youngest of them all, seemed to instinctively understand that something had shifted. She approached Celeste with a bottle of water and a softened expression. "Miss Monroe, is there anything else I can get you?" she asked gently. Celeste looked up, her lips curved into a smile that was polite but distant. "No, thank you," she said. "I have everything I need." And she did, because Celeste wasn't waiting for comfort. She was waiting for consequences. And as the plane sliced through the quotes and the hours ticked by, it became clear to everyone paying attention. The woman they had dismissed was not the one who would leave changed by this flight. No, Celeste Monroe was the storm in the sky, and the landing would be theirs to endure. It came as a soft vibration in her pocket, the kind of message you feel before you hear it, a tremor that crawls up your spine and settles cold in your chest. Emily Hargrove was standing near the front of the plane, pretending to focus on a drink order, but her heart wasn't in it. The moment the turbulence ended, her nerves had only grown louder. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and glanced at the notification with the vague expectation of a routine alert. What she saw instead made her blood run cold. The sender, executive operations. The subject, immediate inquiry. Passenger 18A, Monroe Celeste. Her eyes widened. Her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers trembled so slightly she almost dropped the phone. She opened the message, half hoping it was a mistake, but it wasn't. The email was short, clipped, and unmistakably urgent. The passenger in 18A, formerly seated in 2A, had filed a formal complaint. Not just any complaint, one routed through the airline's executive leadership chain. The wording was surgical, requesting full incident report upon landing. Passenger Monroe holds executive-level relevance to company oversight. Ensure proper protocol is followed immediately. Emily's stomach flipped. She read it twice, then again, trying to absorb what those words really meant. Executive-level relevance. Her hands clutched the edge of the galley counter. The blood drained from her face. She hadn't just moved the wrong person. She had humiliated the wrong person. Celeste Monroe, calm, composed, quiet Celeste Monroe, wasn't some nobody trying to sneak into first class. She wasn't a fraud. She wasn't a problem. She wasn't out of place. She was the woman who had likely helped build the place. Emily's knees felt weak. Her ears rang. Her vision blurred at the edges as she tried to replay every step of the incident in her head. What she'd said, how she'd stood there, arms crossed, voice sharp, eyes narrowed, stripping away someone's dignity in the name of policy. But the worst part, the truly gut-wrenching part, was remembering how Celeste had reacted. With grace, with restraint, with that same unreadable calm that now made perfect, devastating sense. She had known all along. She hadn't needed to defend herself because she had allowed the system to reveal itself, to betray its own bias, and it had. She had. Emily gripped onto the counter, taped her, willing herself not to crumble under the weight of it all. Around her, the hum of the cabin carried on, the soft clink of beverage carts, murmurs of passengers, the dull roar of the engine. But inside, Emily felt like she had just stepped into the eye of a hurricane. She could still see her own reflection in the coffee pot's chrome, pale and glassy-eyed, a flight attendant who had let her instincts turn into judgment, and her judgment into action. Clara passed behind her, cheerful as ever, asking if she needed help restocking. Emily shook her head quickly, unable to find her voice. Her hands were shaking too much to pour water, let alone fix the mistake she'd made. Because how do you undo something like that? How do you apologize for telling a woman who probably had more power in this company than anyone on board that she didn't belong in a seat she had paid for, earned, designed perhaps? She had assumed so much based on nothing. She had looked at Celeste Monroe and decided without realizing it that she didn't fit. And now the realization was crashing over her like waves she couldn't outswim. To the rest of the cabin, Celeste was just another quiet woman with a notebook. But to Emily now, she was something more. Something terrifying, something righteous, something that made her feel like a child caught with her hand in a flame. Because the game was no longer about customer satisfaction or courtesy, it was about accountability. And whether Emily wanted it or not, she was at the center of it now. And yet, here was the twist. Despite it all, despite the way she'd been treated, Celeste hadn't once lashed out. She hadn't called for the captain. She hadn't demanded to speak to a supervisor midair. She hadn't rallied the other passengers or even raised her voice. She had waited. Waited while the system tripped over itself. Waited until the very people who wronged her came face to face with their mistake. Now ask yourself, would you have done the same? Would you have responded to public humiliation with grace? Would you have helped a mother in need even after being treated like you were invisible? Celeste Monroe did, and that's why we don't just respect her. We stand with her. This story, her story, isn't just about a seat on a plane. It's about every moment someone was told they didn't belong based on nothing but someone else's assumption. It's about every quiet injustice, every unspoken slight, every decision made not by facts, but by feelings. So if you're still with us, if you're still listening, then now's the moment to show it. Like this story, share it. Support the woman who refused to be broken and chose instead to reveal the cracks in the system. Because Celeste didn't seek vengeance. She sought truth, and that truth is coming. When this flight lands, there will be meetings. There will be investigations. There will be headlines. But before all of that, before the press conferences and the policy changes, there was a moment, a still, quiet moment when one woman sat in coach not because she belonged there, but because she was waiting for the world to catch up. So don't scroll away. Don't forget her name, Celeste Monroe, the woman who didn't raise her voice because she didn't have to. The air inside the cabin had changed. Not just the recycled, pressurized atmosphere, but something deeper, something intangible. It had started as a shift so small no one could quite name it, a subtle drop in temperature, a glance held just a second too long, a silence stretching between words where there used to be chatter. But by now, even the most distracted passengers could feel it, the quiet, creeping sense that something had gone very wrong. And at the center of it all sat Celeste Monroe, still, silent, and watching. She hadn't moved since the turbulence. She hadn't called attention to herself. She simply remained in 18A, her posture impeccable, her presence impossible to ignore. And that, more than anything else, was what made the rest of the plane so unnervingly aware of her. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. She was the calm at the eye of the storm. and everyone around her was starting to feel the wind pick up. Emily tried to act normal, but her steps betrayed her. She moved stiffly now, like a machine built to perform human gestures, handing out drinks, checking seatbelts, offering napkins with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her confidence, once unshakable, had crumbled into something that resembled panic wearing a uniform. She had made a terrible mistake, and worse, she now understood who she had made it against. Every time she passed row 18, her eyes flickered toward Celeste, and every time Celeste didn't so much as blink. That stillness was more powerful than any confrontation. It was a kind of grace that held the weight of something bigger, something purposeful. Celeste wasn't playing the victim. She wasn't demanding retribution. She was letting the world see what happened when judgment wore a name tag and carried a clipboard. Clara, the younger flight attendant, had started to notice the tension too. She was newer, less hardened, and still believed that kindness was as important as protocol. She had offered Celeste a drink earlier, her tone gentle, her smile sincere. But even Clara now felt the ripples. She could sense the unease in Emily's body language, the way her colleague flinched every time someone said, "Row 18," or "that woman." Something had shifted between them, something unspoken but obvious. Clara didn't know the details, but she knew this much: Celeste wasn't the problem. Emily was, and the other passengers, they were starting to catch on. A few had noticed the earlier confrontation. Others had overheard whispers between the flight crew. Some had simply picked up on the energy, a wrongness in the air, like an engine humming too loud. One by one, their attention began drifting toward Celeste, and not out of suspicion, out of curiosity, out of empathy. She was too poised, too serene to ignore. She didn't fidget, she didn't pout, she didn't reach for her call button. She just was. And that was enough to make them wonder who she really was. Because in a world that rarely rewarded restraint, Celeste's silence had become its own kind of protest, a quiet refusal to play the part she had been assigned. From her seat near the galley, Emily's eyes darted toward the curtain separating first class from the main cabin. It felt like a wall now, a wall she had built, and she couldn't look over it without seeing the consequences of her own assumptions staring calmly back at her. The message from executive leadership still burned in her pocket. She'd read it over and over again, hoping the words might change. They hadn't. Celeste Monroe had filed a formal complaint, but more than that, she had triggered something larger, a recognition among leadership that bias had taken root among the very people tasked with representing the airline's values. The fallout was coming. The shame had already arrived, and Celeste had known. She had known from the moment she was asked to step aside. She had known from the moment Emily refused to believe her boarding pass. She had known and chosen to wait. That was what struck Emily hardest now. Not the mistake, but the patience. The chilling, strategic patience of a woman who had seen this happen before, perhaps many times, and who had mastered the quiet art of letting people reveal their own prejudices. Emily had walked right into it, arms crossed, voice clipped, judgment in her eyes, and Celeste had met it with stillness, with grace, with power. Now the energy in the plane had twisted itself into something taut and fragile. The passengers began whispering, not gossip, but concern. They watched Celeste out of the corners of their eyes, wondering if they should do something, say something. Should they apologize for witnessing injustice and doing nothing? Was it too late to stand up? But Celeste never invited their pity, only their reflection. And you, yes, you listening to this right now, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up when you saw her being moved? Would you have helped pick up her things, offered her your seat? Or would you have looked away and hoped someone else would? Celeste Monroe didn't need your pity. She doesn't need anyone to fight for her. She's been through this before, and she's already 10 steps ahead. But what she does deserve, what we all owe her, is support, is recognition, is our voices finally raised not in outrage but in solidarity. So if you're still here, still following this story, leave a comment. Let her know you see her, that you hear her, that you believe her, because every time someone like Emily makes an assumption, we need someone like Celeste to hold the mirror. And every time someone like Celeste is pushed to the back of the plane, the rest of us have a choice: stay quiet or say not anymore. The tension in the cabin wasn't just discomfort, It was truth unspoken. And now, with every passing minute, that truth was growing louder. Celeste hadn't said a word since she was moved, but everyone on board was starting to feel the weight of what her silence meant. And the landing was going to shake more than just the wheels. The message hit Emily's phone like a gavel slammed down in a courtroom, sharp, final, and impossible to ignore. She stepped into the galley, her breath catching in her throat before she even read the first line. It was from the executive office, not management, not the cabin crew supervisor, the executive office. Her thumb hovered above the screen for a heartbeat that felt like forever, her pulse hammering in her ears as if warning her, this is the moment everything changes. When she finally opened it, the words were simple, yet devastating in their weight. This is a formal directive. Passenger Celeste Monroe is to be treated with the utmost respect. Do not approach her unless absolutely necessary. A full investigation has been initiated. All records of this flight, including internal crew logs, are being reviewed. Prepare a detailed report to be submitted immediately upon landing. Emily's hand trembled. Her chest felt tight, as though the walls of the plane were closing in. For a second, she couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. She had known something was coming ever since she learned who Celeste truly was. But this was confirmation that the ground beneath her was no longer stable, that the mistake she had made, quiet, private, brushed off as routine in the moment, was now a spotlight burning down from the highest level of the airline. And that spotlight was pointed straight at her. She looked toward the aisle through the curtain that separated the galley from the main cabin. Celeste Monroe sat in 18A, as composed as ever, her expression unreadable, her body language undisturbed. But now Emily saw it differently. That stillness wasn't passivity. It was power. Controlled. Quiet. Chosen. Celeste had never once raised her voice, and yet with a single message, she had mobilized the full weight of the airline's corporate structure. Not out of vengeance, but out of principle. And that's what cut deepest of all. Emily stumbled back a step and leaned against the galley wall, her breath shaky, her eyes wide. She thought back to the moment she had made the call to move Celeste, the tone she had used, the assumptions she'd acted on, the way she'd dismissed her like a policy violation instead of a human being. She hadn't meant to hurt anyone. At least, that's what she had told herself. But now, under the crushing weight of this directive, the truth settled in her gut like ice. She had judged someone by how they looked, how they moved, how they didn't conform to what she expected from a first-class passenger. And now she was being called to answer for it. Dennis, the senior flight attendant, appeared beside her. He'd seen the message too. She could tell from the tight lines in his face. "We've got a problem," he muttered. Voice low, eyes serious. Emily nodded, unable to find the words. "You know who she is now, don't you?" Dennis asked. Emily swallowed. "Yeah," she whispered. "I know." And yet, Celeste hadn't changed at all. That's what haunted Emily the most. Celeste hadn't suddenly grown into someone powerful after the email. She had always been that powerful. The only thing that changed was who finally saw her for who she was. Emily looked out again. Celeste sat with her hands folded, her posture elegant, her expression serene. And still, that notebook rested in her lap, closed now, but somehow louder than any shouting match could have been. The other passengers continued to sneak glances toward her, as if sensing that something deeper was unraveling beneath the surface. Because it was. This wasn't just about an airline mistake anymore. This was about the difference between power taken and power possessed. Celeste had never raised her voice, and yet the entire corporate structure had turned to face her. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was a mirror. And now Emily was seeing herself in it, and she hated what she saw. She tried to return to her duties, but the motions felt empty now, hollow. When she served coffee to a passenger in row 12, her hand shook so much she spilled a few drops onto the tray. When she walked by Clara, she couldn't meet the younger woman's eyes. And when she passed Celeste again, just once, Celeste looked up. Their eyes met, not long, just long enough. And in that look, Emily saw everything. There was no triumph in Celeste's gaze. No malice, no revenge, just understanding. Deep, cutting understanding, like she'd seen this before. Lived it, expected it. That's when the guilt hit Emily the hardest. Not because she feared the consequences of the investigation, not because of the email, but because Celeste wasn't angry, because Celeste had forgiven her already, or at least decided not to focus on her. And that kind of strength, that grace, was the most crushing indictment of all. It wasn't about what Emily had done. It was about how many people like Celeste had to walk through the world prepared for it. Are you still listening? If you are, if you're feeling this right now, let it sink in. This is what real strength looks like. Not yelling, not revenge, not tearing others down, but remaining calm, composed, and unbothered while letting the system expose itself. This is why Celeste Monroe matters. This is why we need to see women like her, support women like her, believe women like her. Because in a world that expects them to flinch, Celeste showed us what happens when you stand still and let the truth reveal itself. So please, comment below. Let her know she's not invisible. Let her know she's not alone. Let her know her silence spoke louder than anything else on that plane. Because the story's not over. The landing hasn't even happened yet. But the reckoning has already begun. The wheels of the plane touched down with a soft, controlled thud, and the familiar jolt of landing rippled through the cabin. Seatbelts clicked, necks craned, passengers stirred, and the captain's calm voice filled the space. Welcome to your destination. We ask that you remain seated until we've reached the gate. On any other flight, it would have been background noise, routine. But not this time. Not for Celeste Monroe, not for the crew, and definitely not for Emily Hargrove, who stood near the forward exit, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her they'd gone numb. She didn't hear the announcements. She barely registered the mechanical clatter of the landing gear retracting. All she felt was the deep, gnawing ache in her chest, the ache of knowing what had just happened could not be undone. Celeste sat still in her seat, unmoved by the flurry of motion around her. The moment the plane landed, the energy of the cabin shifted once more, not toward relief or excitement, but tension. Every step, every voice, every glance seemed to stretch just a second too long. People didn't look directly at her anymore, but they felt her presence like gravity. She waited until the front of the plane cleared. She always planned to. She was never in a rush. Her silence, her stillness, had been the loudest thing on that flight. And now it was the final echo. Emily didn't dare look toward the back, but she felt Celeste's approach in her bones. Each quiet footstep closing the space between them was like a drumbeat of reckoning, not rage. She had imagined this moment more than once during the flight, bracing herself for confrontation, a final word, a cutting glance. But when Celeste passed her at last, she said nothing. Not even a glance. She simply walked forward, calm and composed, her scarf draped over her shoulder, her small bag in hand. And that, more than anything, shattered Emily. Because Celeste's restraint was not the absence of feeling. It was the sharpest form of control. The ultimate power, not just knowing what you could say, but choosing not to say it. Emily's breath caught it as Celeste walked by, and for a moment she felt invisible and exposed all at once. Reduced to her mistake, branded by it. And Celeste didn't have to say a word. Her grace had done what shouting never could. She had made sure Emily would never forget her. At the gate, security waited, but not for a confrontation. They were discreet, dressed in plain black suits, standing a respectful distance back, not to restrain or protect Celeste, but to escort her. She didn't acknowledge them with anything more than a soft nod as she exited the aircraft, her presence measured and deliberate. The murmurs began the moment she was gone. Among the passengers, the crew, the gate staff, everyone knew something had happened, even if they didn't yet understand the scope of it. Emily remained rooted in place as the last passengers filed out, her stomach twisted in knots. Dennis stepped beside her, his voice low. "She's gone," he said, almost a whisper. But Emily didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mind was still in row 2A. In the moment she questioned Celeste's ticket, her legitimacy, her right to be there. The image replayed like a cruel loop. Her own voice, cold and sharp. "You'll have to move to the main cabin." Her face burned with shame. Back in the terminal, Celeste walked with the same unshakable poise she had carried onto the plane. The security personnel flanked her subtly, not as guards, but as confirmation. Confirmation that she mattered, that she wasn't alone, Her ride was waiting, a sleek black sedan, its windows tinted, engine quiet, driver standing ready. He opened the door with a silent nod, and Celeste stepped in without hesitation. As the car pulled away from the curb, she looked out at the terminal disappearing behind her, not with bitterness, but with clarity. The plane had landed, but this story was just taking off. Because Celeste had sent more than a complaint. She had sent a message, and people were already listening. The email she received while still taxiing had confirmed it. The airline's legal team had escalated the matter. A full review was underway. Corporate leadership was preparing statements. Her name, once unspoken, was now being whispered through boardrooms and PR offices. And soon, it wouldn't just be whispered. It would be headlines. This wasn't revenge. It was responsibility. Celeste hadn't come to that flight expecting a fight. But when the moment found her, she handled it the way the world had forced her to, with strategy, with silence, and with strength. She hadn't needed to shout. The injustice had been loud enough on its own. And now she was ready to speak. Are you still with us? Are you still listening? Because if you are, this is the moment to let Celeste Monroe know she's not alone. That her quiet resistance wasn't invisible. That the grace she held under pressure meant something. Leave a comment below. Tell her she matters, that you see her, that you believe her, that you call. Because in a world where people are too often judged by how they look, how they dress, how they sit in a seat someone else thinks they don't belong in, Celeste stood her ground without ever raising her voice. And that takes strength most people will never understand. Emily watched the car disappear from the window near the crew lounge, her uniform wrinkled, her expression hollow. The shame in her chest was so heavy she could hardly breathe. She knew her future was uncertain. There would be inquiries, reports, disciplinary action. But more than all of that, she knew this. She had been wrong. Deeply, unquestionably wrong. And now she would live with it. Celeste's footsteps echoed in her memory. Quiet, certain, and with each one Emily knew. The woman she had pushed out of first class had just become the voice of something much larger. And she had helped build the stage. The next morning, the sun filtered through the frosted windows of the airline's downtown headquarters. But the light did little to ease the tension coiling through the halls. Behind closed doors, legal teams, HR officials, and public relations executives poured over every detail of Flight 382, specifically the incident involving Celeste Monroe. In the HR wing, Emily Hargrove sat alone in a sterile conference room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, a bottle of untouched water beside her. Her reflection in the glass across from her looked like a ghost, pale, drained, silent. She'd spent the entire night replaying every second of that flight, every word she'd said to Celeste, every judgment she had passed without realizing just how deeply it would cost her. And now, as the doorknob turned and two senior HR executives entered with blank expressions and thick folders, Emily knew the fallout had officially begun. They didn't yell. They didn't scold. Their tone was even, professional, and impossibly calm, almost clinical. We've reviewed the preliminary documentation of yesterday's incident, one of them said, not bothering to sit. Due to the severity and the visibility of the complaint, you're being placed on immediate suspension pending a full investigation. The words hit Emily like a blow, not because she didn't expect them, but because hearing them made it real. The passenger in question, Mr. Celeste Monroe, the second executive continued, has since been confirmed as a high-ranking equity partner with direct advisory access to our board. Her complaint has escalated beyond internal review. It's being addressed at the executive level. Emily flinched. Her mind reeled. Celeste wasn't just powerful. She was integrated, woven into the fabric of the very institution Emily had worked for her entire career. Effective immediately, the voice continued, you are not to have contact with Ms. Monroe. Any attempts to interfere with this investigation will be met with formal disciplinary action. And then, after a heavy pause, Emily, what happened on that flight cannot be dismissed as a misunderstanding. It was a failure in judgment, a reflection of unconscious bias that has now endangered the company's reputation. And hers. Emily blinked, trying to speak, but nothing came out. Her voice had been loud enough when she told Celeste she didn't belong, But now, when it was time to explain, to own it, she had nothing. Meanwhile, across the city, Celeste sat in a quiet meeting room of her own, this one bright, polished, and respectful. Her lawyer sat beside her, reviewing statements and documents that had come in overnight. But Celeste wasn't focused on the legal proceedings. Her attention was elsewhere, on the flood of emails, messages, and direct outreach she'd received from other passengers, employees, and strangers who had heard whispers of what happened. Some messages were filled with apologies, others with outrage. But many came from people who had been through similar moments. I was told I didn't look like I belonged in first class. They asked to see my ID even after my boarding pass cleared. They made me feel small. They made me feel invisible. And that was the moment Celeste realized. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. Later that day, the airline's CEO requested an urgent call with her. The tone was apologetic, respectful. "Ms. Monroe, yeah, I am. Hi, Sister Monroe," he began. "We want to start by saying we're deeply sorry for what happened. It does not reflect our values." Celeste didn't let him finish. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "It does. That's why it happened." The pause on the line was thick with discomfort, and Celeste allowed it. She had earned that silence. The CEO listened, truly listened, as Celeste laid out her experience with brutal honesty. Not just the removal from her seat, but the eyes of the passengers that followed her down the aisle. The subtle shame of being judged, diminished, dismissed. "You have procedures," she said, "but you don't train perception. And until you do, your people will keep making assumptions about who belongs, about who matters." The call ended with a promise. The company would issue a public apology and a formal review of hiring practices, crew training, and passenger treatment policies would begin immediately. But for Celeste, this wasn't enough. She wanted systemic change. The next day, she released a public letter, not bitter, not accusatory, but clear. She wrote about what happened in measured words. She described the humiliation of being displaced not because her documents were invalid, but because her presence made someone uncomfortable. She wrote about how easy it was to see bias when it wore a uniform and smiled, how professionalism could still carry prejudice, and how she chose silence, not because she had no voice, but because she wanted people to see the truth for themselves. That letter went viral within hours. Celebrities reposted it, activists applauded it. Passengers from every walk of life, young, old, wealthy, struggling, flooded the airline's social media with support for her. "I Stand With Celeste" trended globally within 24 hours. And suddenly, a woman who had been quietly moved to the back of the plane was now moving the conversation forward for an entire industry. And yet, through it all, Celeste never once sought to punish. Even in private, she spoke not of revenge, but responsibility. "I don't want her fired," she told her legal team when asked about Emily. "I want her to understand." Because Celeste knew the deeper cost of bias wasn't the reputation it threatened, but the humanity it stripped. She didn't want to destroy the people who had wronged her. She wanted them to grow, to reckon, to change. Are you still here? Are you still listening? Then let Celeste know her courage mattered. Let her know that this woman who sat in silence while a system tried to shrink her is now changing that system from the inside out. Leave a comment below. Let her know you believe in her mission. Let her know her dignity didn't go unseen, because there are thousands of people like her, sitting in row 18, in boardrooms, in offices, in waiting rooms, carrying themselves with quiet strength while the world tries to tell them they're in the wrong place. Celeste Monroe didn't fight back with anger. She fought with presence, and presence is what changed everything. The headlines came like thunder, loud, relentless, and impossible to ignore. Passenger reassigned mid-flight revealed to be airline insider, sparks industry reckoning. Grace under pressure, Celeste Monroe's silent stand against discrimination. When bias takes flight, the woman who changed everything without saying a word. Within 48 hours, the story of what happened on Flight 382 was everywhere. News anchors discussed it with incredulity. Editorial columns dissected it with outrage. Social media ignited like wildfire, and the quiet, elegant woman who had once walked down an airplane aisle in silence now stood at the epicenter of a national conversation. But Celeste Monroe never asked for fame. She hadn't orchestrated this moment to elevate herself. She had endured a private indignity, one that could have quietly passed by, dismissed as a misunderstanding, but instead, she turned it into a public reckoning. And the world listened. Videos began to surface, fuzzy phone clips recorded by passengers on the flight. One showed her being escorted from first class, calm and dignified, while the voice of a flight attendant, cold and clipped, delivered the instruction that would change everything. Another showed her kneeling to help a young mother mid-flight, her scarf trailing over her shoulder, her voice soothing a screaming baby as if nothing had happened. "That's her," one voice whispered in the background. "That's the woman they moved." The internet did what it always does, but this time it amplified not a scandal, but a symbol of grace, of strength, of quiet resistance in the face of casual injustice. Talk shows picked it up, podcasts, panels. People weren't just talking about Celeste Monroe. They were holding her up as an emblem of something far greater. The executive who got bumped to coach, the leader who didn't flinch, the woman who held her power without ever weaponizing it. Airline insiders began leaking stories of internal panic, emergency meetings, crisis communications, huddles trying to find the right language, the right apology, the right spin. But no one could spin the truth, because the truth was captured in Celeste's silence. She had never yelled. She had never made a scene. She had simply sat down, sent a single message, and let the system collapse beneath its own hypocrisy. Major airlines began issuing public statements, one after another, each promising renewed focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Training manuals were being rewritten. Workshops were mandated. Employees from other carriers spoke out anonymously, admitting, "This happens more often than people realize." Passengers of color began sharing their stories under the hashtag I was Celeste, moments where they too were doubted, questioned, treated as though they didn't belong. Thousands of comments flooded in. "You gave me a voice. You handled what I never could. Thank you for making them look in the mirror." But through it all, Celeste stayed steady. She wasn't flattered about the praise. She wasn't seduced by the spotlight. She used it, deliberately, strategically, to shift the conversation toward what mattered. On a morning news broadcast, her first public interview aired. She sat in a navy blue suit, simple, powerful, with her hands clasped gently in her lap. The interviewer asked, "Why didn't you speak up on the plane?" Celeste's answer was quiet but firm. "Because if I had raised my voice, they would have called me emotional, difficult, angry. I've learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people expose themselves." And they did. She looked directly into the camera then, not with resentment, but with resolve. This isn't about punishing one person. It's about fixing a culture that lets people decide who belongs based on what they think they see. The audience erupted. Viewers flooded the station's social media with praise. Clips were shared millions of times, comment sections lit up with support. And the woman who had been quietly humiliated just days earlier was now reshaping the way an industry thought about perception, privilege, and power. And now we ask you, are you still listening? Because Celeste Monroe didn't fight this battle alone. She carried the weight of 1,000 unseen incidents, the second glances, the tightened lips, the quiet exclusions people face every day without cameras rolling. She did what many couldn't. She endured, she waited, and she let the truth speak for itself. That takes strength, that takes clarity, that takes courage. So if her story moved you, if her poise made you pause, if her silence struck something deep inside you, show her. Like this story, comment below. Tell her she's not alone. Let Celeste Monroe know that her voice, though it spoke softly, roared across the world. Because this wasn't just a viral moment. This was a mirror held up to an industry, a workplace, a society. And in that mirror, people finally saw what they were too afraid to admit, that discrimination doesn't always scream. Sometimes it's a whisper, a pause, a look, a reassignment without reason, a question disguised as protocol. But Celeste saw it for what it was, and instead of snapping back, she planted her feet and let the world watch what happens when dignity refuses to move. Back at headquarters, the airline's CEO held a press conference. flanked by board members, apologizing publicly and announcing sweeping policy changes. Mandatory bias training, a new executive role to oversee passenger experience inequity. And Celeste? She'd been offered a formal seat at the table, not just as a consultant, but as a voice shaping long overdue reform. She hadn't asked for it. She didn't need it. But she accepted it, not for her own gain, but to ensure what happened to her never happened again. Behind the scenes, Emily Hargrove watched from her apartment, suspended and silent. Her hands shook as she watched Celeste speak. Not out of fear, out of something deeper, something like shame, something like awe. She had never imagined the woman she judged so quickly would change everything so quietly. She replayed the moment she told Celeste to move, how certain she had been. And now she understood just how wrong certainty could be. So now it's your turn. Will you stand with Celeste? Will you show that grace and strength still matter? That dignity isn't weakness, but power? Leave a comment, leave encouragement. Let her know her story mattered. Because Celeste Monroe didn't just sit and coach. She stood for all of us. And her flight, her real flight, has only just begun. The seasons changed, and with them, so did the airline. Gone were the vague promises and corporate platitudes. In their place stood bold policies, new leadership initiatives, and mandatory equity training for all staff, from senior pilots to new hire gate agents. But none of that would have happened without one woman who never raised her voice, Celeste Monroe. Months had passed since Flight 382, and while the headlines had faded from the front page, the ripple effects she created had only grown stronger. It started with the airline she quietly co-owned, where she helped design a new internal program called Elevate, a leadership pipeline dedicated to ensuring diverse voices were not only heard, but empowered. Then came speaking invitations, university panels, advocacy roundtables. But through it all, Celeste remained herself, humble, composed, and rooted in the belief that the real change didn't come from outrage, but from clarity, compassion, and courage. And now, on a sunny spring morning, she sat at a round table of industry executives, finalizing a coalition that would set standards for passenger dignity across all major carriers. It wasn't just about one seat anymore. It was about thousands. And the world was finally listening. But Celeste never saw herself as a hero. She saw herself as a reminder that sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who says nothing at all. The one who endures the moment, not for revenge, but to make sure the moment doesn't happen again. Her story had reached millions, not because she shouted, but because she gave others the space to hear themselves, because she let the truth do the talking. And what about Emily? She didn't lose her job. She almost did, but after weeks of suspension, after mandated training, and after an emotional handwritten letter to Celeste, she was allowed to return, this time not as the same woman who walked that aisle with bias in her bones, but as someone deeply changed. She had started her own personal journey of reflection, accountability, and healing. Emily even requested a transfer to ground operations, where she began working with new hires, teaching them not just about protocol, but about the humanity behind every seat number, every name, every glance. Her mistakes would never be forgotten, but neither would the growth they inspired. The airline's culture had changed, but so had its people. And in that transformation, we find the heart of this story. Celeste Monroe didn't just fix a flight, she helped rewrite the future. She showed us that your power doesn't always come from titles, or money, or public displays. Sometimes it's found in the stillness, in refusing to be rattled, in making sure the next person doesn't have to go through what you did. And that's something every one of us can learn from. Because maybe you've been Celeste, misjudged, silenced, sidelined, and had to carry your worth with quiet strength. Or maybe, if you're being honest, you've been Emily, sure of yourself, unaware of your bias, needing a moment to wake you up. Either way, there's a lesson here for all of us. Treat people like they belong until they show you otherwise. Lead with empathy, not assumption, and never underestimate the power of quiet resilience. Celeste's story may have started in seat 2A, but it became something so much bigger than a boarding pass. It became a movement, a message, a moment that told the world, you can't always control how people see you, but you can control how you carry yourself. And that's where true power lives. So if this story meant something to you, show it. Leave a comment below to thank Celeste for her strength. Like this video if you believe grace can be more powerful than rage. Support her journey by reminding others. No seat defines your worth. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful true stories. Stories of resilience, of transformation, of people just like you making a difference one quiet moment at a time. Because there are thousands of Celestes out there. Sitting in meetings where they're overlooked, walking into rooms where they're underestimated, flying on flights where they're told they don't belong. Let this story be a light for them. Let it be a reminder that silence isn't weakness, and that calm doesn't mean compliance. Let it be proof that how you respond to injustice matters just as much as whether you fight it. And if Celeste could rewrite a system from seat 18A, imagine what you could do. Wherever you are right now, imagine what we could all do together. The plane may have landed, but the journey continues. And Celeste Monroe, she didn't just reach her destination. She became the destination.